Hey, how's it going out there? Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Toma Todito Show. And I'm going to dive in here real quick and try to figure out what's been going on with Bellator MMA, the second biggest organization within the United States as far as MMA is considered. You have the World Series of Fighting, which is another organization, and it seems to be like taking the third place within the U.S., but it doesn't seem like it's that far from bringing in numbers that Bellator is. You have one championship, which has basically cemented itself throughout Asia and in a large portion of Europe, and then the UFC. Of course, it's the MMA giant, the main brand across the world and world renowned. So Bellator finds themselves in the second position, and it's really odd. Some of the biggest issues that I constantly see with and hear about from Bellator is the fact that nobody knows when their fights are happening. Unless you're a hardcore Bellator fan, people don't really know when these fights are happening. There's a big confusion as far as the advertising, the promotional aspect, and the promotional approach that Bellator takes, to where unless you're watching Paramount TV or unless you're always hooked on the zone, you're never going to know as to when the upcoming fight is. You see these ads every so often. You see them pop up on YouTube at random, but it's nothing like the UFC is doing. And of course, the UFC has cemented themselves and built the brand to such a magnitude in which people are actually looking and constantly logging in to these sites and the UFC forums to figure out when the next opponent is. And they do a very good job of promoting their fights as a fight is happening. They're in a pay-per-view and they'll be promoting it. They promote it through your video game consoles. They promote it through their video games. They're everywhere. And so you know that the biggest fight coming up is going to take place on so-and-so date because they do such a good job and they have the budget. They have the money to be able to promote. Bellator, on the other hand, although they have good enough money, they're trying to compete. In my opinion, they're trying to compete with the UFC in the United States, within the United States, at the dollar, going dollar for dollar, and you can't do it. And that's the underdog story, where if you remember back when they came into 2011, this is what they've gotten away from. They're trying to figure out this their niche. They're trying to figure out their purpose within the market and their stance within the market, and they've gotten away from so many approaches that they've taken in the past. If you recall, Bellator started in 2011, and they were basically the avenue for the up-and-coming prospects, the semi-established fighters that were not well known. You didn't have the biggest names, but they used to provide a tournament style, 8-man tournament style show. And so whoever won that tournament obviously won the money, this and that. They got away from that. They've changed ownership through the years. Now you have Scott Coker, who was the former head of Strikeforce, and now he's on top of Bellator. And he was doing something good with Strikeforce, but he also had the backing of Showtime, and he had a better promotional team around him. Strikeforce was so successful because when people tried to discard Strikeforce back in the day as being the B-level fighters, the C-level fighters, the competition not being as good as the UFC, you started seeing some really big names join that organization. Names like Daniel Cormier, with such big fights. You had Bigfoot Silva, you had Robbie Lawler, you had Nick Diaz, you had Jake Shields, Gilbert Melendez. Rory McDonald was over there. You had such big following and big fights, meaningful fights. Kung Lee was over there, Frank Shamrock, you name it. People were not buying the fact that they were the B-level fighters or the C-level fighters. At that time, a lot of fighters were having contractual issues with the UFC, and so they would just leave and go over with Scott Coker, and the word was that Coker was known for taking care of the fighters and making them happy and catering to them. They had the big venue out of California, so it became like a world-renowned spot where the San Jose Sharks, the hockey team, play. They were at that San Jose Pavilion, and they just made it the ultimate house for Strikeforce. they had a lot to offer, and they focused within their organization, not trying to outdo the UFC, but they focused within the organization. They had a lot to offer, and they brought leverage to their side. And the business move, Bellator needs to focus as to the fighters and the type of fighters that they have. Their roster, they have a big roster from Europe, a lot of Russian-based fighters. They have a lot of Brazilian fighters, and they have a lot of big names that may not be household names here in the U.S., but they should be catering to those fighters within their countries. If they were to get their promotional approach and take a different promotional approach, instead of trying to go dollar for dollar with the UFC, which they can't because their budget is not there, the numbers that they're bringing in are not there, instead of trying to compete and take their stance and set their foot here within the United States, if I was running Bellator or if I was helping them out, I would be promoting around the world. You have one championship who has cemented their stance throughout Asia, but you have a big following in Europe. Why is Bellator not promoting within Europe, getting the eyes of the world, which are constantly focused on these US-based promotions, and more so on the UFC than anything? Why don't you start growing your promotion around the country? Bring leverage over to your side. Get momentum back on your side. Start promoting in Brazil. Start promoting throughout Europe. Start promoting in all the Russian-based countries where your fighters are from. Ukraine, Dagestan. You take that approach. Instead of using the dollar, you take a different approach and go promote in the countries in which your dollar will go a lot further. So you'll be able to get better promotion, get your social media promotion on your game on check, because you guys are trying to compete with the UFC and you barely know when to tune into your fights. You barely have an idea who's fighting there. And it seems like the approach the last few years has been of trying to build the next star, trying to build the next big hype so people tune in. Instead of focusing on one fighter, focus on the brand, focus on the name. Get that company to where it becomes a world-renowned company rather than just mostly US-based, and people that follow certain fighters from around the world are tuning in because their favorite fighter happens to be fighting in that organization. But the moment that they jump over to the UFC, those eyes and that viewership is going to change hands also. So grow the brand to where people begin to be loyal to your brand, similar to what Strikeforce was able to pull out. Once leverage ended up going Strikeforce's way and they were just such a big force to be reckoned with, what did the UFC do? They end up acquiring Strikeforce, not on pennies on the dollar. They end up acquiring and create a merger with Strikeforce to where eventually Strikeforce went out of business. Same thing with Pride. UFC took over that business. It was too much to compete with. Such big name fighters all of a sudden are coming back. Quentin Jackson, the Nogueiras, they're coming back to the UFC. Bigfoot Silva was also over there at Pride. Then you have your Robbie Lawlers, your Rory McDonalds. All of a sudden, all these people are coming over to the UFC, and it was just too much for the UFC to deal with. And that's the approach that Coker, he did it once with Strikeforce. When Strikeforce figured out that instead of trying to compete with pay-per-views, they would have their show on Showtime, which is cable TV, premium channel at that, and then they would do cards on CBS. And rather than compete against boxing and UFC, which they have the battle at that time, Dana White and UFC just focused on the big cards, the Mayweathers, the Pacquiao cards, the big dates, trying to fight against boxing. They were not even looking back at what Strikeforce was doing, and Strikeforce figured it out. They start doing regular cable TV, CBS shows. They start taking on the 5 o'clock and the 6 o'clock time frames rather than the 8 o'clock primetime hours for television and sports viewership. They figure out that they could do a 4 o'clock card. They could do a 5 o'clock card. In the hours in that gap, in that time gap leading to the primetime hours. And Strikeforce began to grow. The eyes begin to grow. What else does Strikeforce do? The women's division, something that Dana White said he would never do and he would never create within the UFC. He had no choice because at that point, it was too big of a monster to compete against. So he took over the company. He takes over Strikeforce, and then we have the effect felt around the world of Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate and how they begin to draw the biggest pay-per-view numbers for the UFC than any other man on the roster. And not until Conor McGregor came did those numbers that Ronda Rousey was producing and the eyes and the attention that she brought to the UFC, not until Conor McGregor came were those numbers broken. So if you look at what Strikeforce did, and Coker is running Bellator right now, start applying the same approach. Focus on the brand rather than trying to create a few stars, a few superstars within that organization, so you don't have the same effect as a Michael Chandler leaving after having been with the organization from the beginning. You have a lot of good fighters out there. You have the Pitbull brothers. You have Michael Venom Page, MVP. Wow, I mean, Douglas. You have Lima, right? You have Douglas Lima. You got Gegard Mousasi. Who? Ivan Nemkov is out there. Ryan Bader revived his career after leaving the UFC. He's out there. Cory Booker just had a great showing out there. So you have really good fighters. Just keep focusing and growing the brand. I would say don't blink on Bellator. I really am hopeful and keeping my fingers crossed that they're going to get their game straight here in 2021. And if they take the approach of growing around the world rather than trying to just focus on the United States, I think their brand is going to skyrocket and leverage is going to go over to them and put the UFC in a position where they start actually noticing Bellator and maybe possibly buy them out, but they'll have to buy them out at top dollar and not pennies on the dollar. So Scott Coker is very smart in the sense that he's done this before. He needs to do it again. He needs to get back to basics and take the approach that he did with Strikeforce. Don't blink on Bellator. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in Bellator. It just doesn't get promoted properly, and you barely even know what's happening there. So, what do they have left for this year? They only have one card left this year. They have McFarlane, this is going to be a women's matchup that's going to be headlining the event. The fight should be taking place November 19th was their last card. They're going to be taking place on December 10th. So that's the other thing that they've been doing, not fights on the weekends, but they do fights during the week. And that's another thing that's been throwing them off, right? December 12th, it's a big boxing night. As we mentioned here before, you have Danny Garcia. That's December 5th. December 12th, you got Anthony Joshua, Kubrat Pulev that are fighting that night. And you have UFC, Davison Figueiredo just turning around from his last victory just a couple weeks ago. And he's going to turn around against Brandon Moreno, who also fought on that card. And that's when we're going to see Tony Ferguson, UFC 256. So December 12th should be that Saturday. The Bellator card's focusing on a Thursday. And with that said, a lot of people don't focus on that on Thursday night Bellator, Thursday night MMA. They got a lot of stuff that they got to figure out. McFarlane against Velasquez at the Mohegan Sun, which has been the home to Bellator and their bubble that they got, their bubble environment that they created there. So that's Bellator 254, and that's going to be their last event for the year. So keep an eye out for that. A lot of exciting fights, a lot of exciting fighters within that brand. They're just not getting any noise. So I'm always rooting for the underdog, and I hope Bellator fixes their game up in 2021 so they don't go out of business and they could actually do justice to the amazing fighters and the amazing roster that they currently have under their flagship. So I'll leave you guys with that. Sorry that it's such a long-winded, but I get so excited about this because I see a lot of potential in this brand. Nonetheless, take care of yourself, and we'll talk soon. Take care.